Hi, I'm Tanya Granick Allen, president of Parents as First Educators, or as some of you may know us as PACE.
Hi, I'm Queenie Yu, leader of the protest party Stop the New Sex Ed Agenda. I also ran as the independent candidate against Kathleen Wynne's sex ed curriculum.
I'm sorry, could we just start that again?
No problem.
Yeah.
Ready?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Tanya Granick Allen, president of Parents as First Educators, or as many of you know us as PACE.
Hi, I'm Queenie Yu, leader of the protest party Stop the New Sex Ed Agenda. I ran as the independent candidate in the Scarborough Rouge River by-election against Kathleen Wynne's sex ed curriculum. Today we're with Dr. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology and clinical psychologist. Welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you.
Excellent. In 2015, as you may be aware, Kathleen Wynne introduced a controversial sex education curriculum to Ontario schools. A lot of parents protested, a lot of parents are upset. In grade 1, for example, they're introduced the concept of consent and they're learning specific names of genitalia. In grade 3, the concept of gender theory is introduced to the children. Parents are barely mentioned in the curriculum, and when they are, sometimes it's at the bottom of a very long list of resources children can turn to if they need information or help. You're a parent. What effects do you think this curriculum is having on children in Ontario?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to the direct effects. I know that from what I understand of the philosophy that underlies the sex ed curriculum, children are being taught an essentially social constructionist view of identity, and that view is predicated on the idea that there's no true linkage between biological sex, or perhaps even that there's no such thing as biological sex, and that that's not linked, even if there is such a thing, it's not linked in any necessary way to gender identity or gender expression or to sexual proclivity. And I believe that that's a false doctrine. I think the evidence is overwhelming that those 4 levels of analysis are tightly linked, and the idea that they can or should be dissociated is, well, it's a radical idea, and I don't think it has any basis in genuine fact. That isn't to say that there aren't people for whom those 4 levels of identity are linked in different ways, because clearly they are. But I don't like the underlying philosophy, and I don't like the fact that it's being foisted on children far before they're able to make any reasonable decisions about this sort of thing. So,
Many parents think their children are being indoctrinated at school, but they're afraid to speak out because they think their children are going to be targeted. They fear for their own jobs. What would you say to these parents?
they're in the majority. And that's a good thing to remember. And you also have to decide what's important to you. The people who are pushing these sorts of agendas are actually quite a small minority. They're very noisy and they're very, very well organized. But if you don't stand up and do something about it, especially when it affects your own family, then all that's going to happen is that it's going to continue to spread. And you can see this already with the increased emphasis that the same people are placing on ideas like equity in the workplace, which basically means equality of outcome, which is an absolutely pathological idea. So if your children are being educated in a manner that you don't approve of at school, your primary responsibility is to your children. Don't send them to the classes. Keep them at home and take the consequences. There's enough of you out there so that if you did that what's going to happen? I don't think they'll be targeted in any particular way, because I'm not sure exactly what that means, if your children are targeted. But
Being treated differently by teachers, by the principal.
well, you're already objecting to the way they're being treated, so this would be just a different way of being treated in a way that you objected to. It seems to me that it's preferable if you're philosophically or psychologically or spiritually opposed to the doctrine, then you have to decide where your responsibility is. I mean, if you don't stand your ground, then all that happens is people push you backwards. So if you want to be pushed backwards, then go along with it. So, and if you don't, then stop doing it. You may find that you have a lot more support than you think.
Despite massive protests and public outcry, Kathleen Wynne forced her sex ed curriculum into schools. Many parents, they feel defeated and they want to give up. What advice would you give to these parents?
Well, I would say again, don't send your kids to the classes that you don't approve of. So, and take the consequences. Like, there's lots of you. And Kathleen Wynne and her band of radical left cronies think they have a handle on what constitutes human identity and also what should constitute human morality. And I think that that's being pushed in a manner in schools that's completely reprehensible. So it's not education, in my estimation, it's a form of indoctrination. And if your children are being indoctrinated, then you should stop it. So, you know, you can't say that you'll go along with it unless you're also saying that you don't put your children's well-being at the top of your priority list. So you got to make your choices. That's what I would say. So if you object to it, I don't believe that the government, it's not proper for the government to intrude too thoroughly into the domain of the family. It's inappropriate. It's been tried before. It's a big mistake. And the reason for that is that there's lots of parents who aren't good for their children, but all things considered, there's nobody better for children than parents. And so the more power you take away from parents, the more damage you do children, because you think, well, there's some uncaring parents and there's some ignorant parents, but the degree to which children are harmed by them is not even comparable to the degree that they'll be harmed by arm's length institutions that are hypothetically set up for their own good. So if you think as a parent that you have the ultimate responsibility, let's say, for the destiny of your children, then you should act in a manner that's concordant with that. It's not such a big deal to keep them out of classes that you don't approve of. I mean, it's a pain in the neck and all of that, but the danger is minimal, and the people that you're facing are, generally speaking, quite cowardly, except when they're in groups, and so I don't think you have that much to fear. Plus, you're in the majority, the vast majority, and if people would, you won't find that out until you make a stand of some sort. So,
Ontario recently introduced Bill 89, called the Supporting Children, Youth, Families Act, which kind of governs how foster agencies, child services, judges, and so on and so forth take into account how they intervene when a child's at risk. So recently they decided to add in, or they're proposing to add in language, which includes gender identity and gender expression when they're deciding when to intervene with a child. So for example, a child who's suffering or at risk of suffering mental emotional harm and whose parents do not provide treatment or access to treatment is what would be deemed as a child in need of protection under this law. A lot of parents are concerned because recently our Ontario Minister of Children and Youth Services said, and I quote, "I would consider that a form of abuse when a child identifies one way and a caregiver saying, no, you need to do this differently."
yeah, well, the big issue there is, in principle, when is a child a reasonable determinant of the direction of their identity? And the answer to that is, don't do anything hasty until the child's an adult. That's my sense of it. That's the same position that Ken Zucker held with such things. Is, you can make a case perhaps that a child as young as 3 years old knows what his or her gender identity should be, but I don't buy that. It's very difficult to tell what's going on with young children, especially because they're engaged in fantasy play a tremendous amount of the time. And we're in a situation right now where there's so much political noise around the idea of gender identity that your certainty that decisions will be taken on behalf of your children that are actually in the best interest of the children, rather than having them be treated as a pawn in some sort of larger political game, is very, very low. I don't think that children's best interests are being put forward by policies such as this. It's a mistake, and we're going to pay for it in a big way, because we're moving very rapidly to a point where radical interventions like puberty blocking hormones, for example, or even surgical interventions are being implemented on younger and younger people, and that's permanent. So, Zucker's work, Ken Zucker's work, has showed quite clearly that most kids who have gender identity issues settle into let's call it their biological identity, the identity with their biological body by the time they're adults. A fair number of them end up gay, but it's better to leave the drastic interventions until the child's an adult, as far as I'm concerned, and caution should be the byword. Now you could say, well, that's rough because the child already knows if he's a boy that he's actually a girl, or vice versa, but we don't allow children to make decisions like that with many other things that are relevant and important to them. And I think that the argument that you're protecting them more by delaying than hurting them is a very, very powerful argument. I don't trust the other argument. I don't trust the people who are making it. I think they care about the political agenda, and they're perfectly willing to sacrifice children to it. And of course, my rule of thumb is, when in doubt, go with the traditional categories, because at least we know that the traditional categories have some function and some utility. And these new categories, we have no idea how they're going to play out or how many people actually fall into them or what their actual social roles will be. And you're not helping kids by radically confusing them about the identities that they might adopt. Not in my estimation. I don't think that's freedom. I think it's confusion. So.
Bill 89 passed second reading without a single vote of dissent. Many people, however, have been writing to their MPP and asking them to vote against Bill 89. Do you think that elected officials have more of a responsibility to speak out?
I think the conservative officials are afraid. I know they are because I've talked to lots of conservative people and also to people who are running for the conservative leadership, and they all say the same thing, which is that the individual MPs and MLAs or MPPs are afraid to be, pinpointed as individuals who are bigoted or phobic, to use that horrible terminology, and so they won't vote the way that they would be inclined to if they weren't afraid of being hounded and targeted. And I think that's reprehensible as well, because if you're going to be an elected official, one of your duties is to take the heat for your beliefs. If you can't do it, well, especially if you're conservative and you can't do it, then you might as well just fold up your tent and go home. Because if you've decided that everything you think is now sufficient to target you as reprehensible or deplorable, then you're what you stand for is already done with. You're done. And yeah, I see that happening very often with conservative people. And they have a legitimate point of view. It's not the only point of view, obviously, but it's a legitimate point of view. But if your elected officials can't even act out the doctrines that they claim to adhere to, then the whole thing is over. So it's like parents. If you don't agree, then don't act out things you don't agree with. It's as simple as that. It's a form of deceit. It's a lie. It's a sacrifice of your soul. You think, well, I don't want to be hassled about it. It's like, okay, well, back off and abandon your beliefs and see how far you get. See where you end up if you do that. You see, one of the things people don't understand is that often in life, you have a choice between two terrible alternatives. There isn't a good route. Lots of times, it's risk A or risk B. That's all you've got. You don't have happy, moving forward easily route. That isn't there. And so you can either pay the price for standing up for what you believe in, or you can pay the price for not standing up for what you believe in. And I think that the second price is much higher. The problem is it takes longer to kick in. So, if you stand up and voice your opposition or act out your opposition, which I would say sometimes is even more effective, then you have to take heat right away. And people are very conflict avoidant, unbelievably conflict avoidant, and so they're willing to forestall the trouble into the future. But it's going to be, the more people back off, the more trouble they're storing up for the future. It's as simple as that. So decide, do you want a fair bit of trouble now or even more trouble later? That's it. That's your choice. For the MPPs, for the parents who don't agree with these sorts of things, what does it mean if you don't agree? If you don't stop going along with it? You agree if you go along with it. You can flail about all you want and say that you don't agree. If you act it out, then you agree. It's as simple as that. And it's not, especially because we're kowtowing to a very small and radical minority of people who have disproportionate power at all sorts of levels of institutions and government. And if you're cowardly and you back off, well, then you get exactly what you deserve. So that's why democracy works to some degree. You get punished for your own stupidity. So.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Can I get you to straighten your tie a little bit?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, continue.
Do you need to switch cards or you're okay?
No, still good.
Dr. Peterson, through your videos and lectures, you've been raising awareness of the dangers of Bill C-16, the federal C-16. How do you see C-16 affecting families and in everyday life?
Well, there's two things I don't like about C-16, and one is that it forces the use of a certain kind of language, and it's the language that permeates, I would say, postmodern neo-Marxist viewpoints, and I don't agree with those viewpoints. I think they're dangerous. I think they're corrupting the university. I think they're pathologizing young people to a great degree, and I think that as soon as you agree to play the language game that your opponents have set out for you, then again, you've lost. there's that, and that's the forced speech element of it, which I think is truly reprehensible, that the government would dare to legislate what people have to say. That's a line we shouldn't cross under any circumstances whatsoever. It happens, in this situation, it happens to be about gender-neutral pronouns, but in some sense that's just a sideshow. I don't really care what it's about. What I care about is that the government thinks that its place is to tell people what words they have to use. No way, man. No way. Not that. That's not happening as far as I'm concerned. And then the second thing I really don't like about Bill C-16 is that its surrounding policies, especially with regards to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, make a social constructionist view of gender, of identity, of human identity, mandatory. And what's so annoying about that is that, first of all, that isn't, you hear radical leftist types talk about the scientific consensus that's emerged about the fact that there's no biological differences between men and women. It's palpably absurd. They fall back on what they call their peer-reviewed research, which is nothing but documents of their opinions that they've circulated to like-minded cronies for their check of approval. No one reads the damn things. There are 80% of their humanities papers have 0 citations, and they claim that that constitutes some sort of scholarly consensus. So, and Bill C-16 and the Ontario Human Rights provisions are even worse than social constructionism, because at least with the social constructionists, there's some rigor there. They say that much of what human beings are is enculturated, learned through enculturation, which is true, although much of it isn't because it's grounded in biology. But they take it even further, and they did that because they watered down the original legislation as a consequence of multiple meetings with activist types, to the point where your identity technically is nothing more than your opinion about who you are at any moment. And that's completely absurd. Your identity, first of all, has a function. Like, to have a functional identity means that you've set yourself up so that you could progress through life with the toolbox that you've developed. It's actually like a set of tools, your identity. And then the second thing is, your identity is something that's always negotiated with other people. You learn that on the playground. Technically, seriously, that's where you learn it. At about 3 years of age, when you start playing with other children, you learn that your identity is socially negotiated. Well, the Bill C-16 and its surrounding policies just dispense with all of that. No biological effect. Okay, how about a cultural effect? Well, not when you push it. It's not even a cultural effect. It's just your whim. You're whoever you say you are at any moment. And then and other people are legally required to go along with that, your fantasy game. And that's not to say that there aren't people who don't fit neatly into the standard and traditional categories at every level of standard and traditional category. Of course there are. But that's in some sense beside the point. That doesn't mean that people can take their idiosyncrasies and impose them by force and fiat on other people. That isn't how society works. In fact, it's exactly the opposite to how society works, because society is essentially based on